nostalgic blitz kind of footage. This is the sound of the Hebden Bridge flood siren, okay, which is located just outside the town hall here. The first time I heard that, it scared the living daylights out of me. I was sitting in my office at home, just up the hill here. I live in Hebden. And that started going off. What are you to think on a Thursday afternoon at 11 o'clock, or Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, when that starts going off? It will stop in a second. And the point about this is that Hebden Bridge has rather a tendency to flood. And in fact, a couple of years ago, it actually did that. And here's a picture from just the bottom of my street of the co-op up to its knees in water. Okay, so 22nd of June 2012. That was actually the first of 2 to 3 fairly significant flooding events in and around Hebden. And this is kind of, you know, where my interest in open data kind of started. I didn't know it at the time, but this is kind of the genesis of it. And people were sharing this kind of thing. This is actually a screen grab from my phone. It's a static image. People were taking screen grabs and sharing them around on Twitter, saying, look, flooding's happening. So clearly people were interested in what was going on in their community and were trying to make the best of the capabilities they had, the data that was available. Key point about this, and it's particularly interesting when you look at the scale at the bottom. So this is over the course of one day. The river goes all the way up through that level and then back down. Okay, so that was one day. Just goes to show how fast things move when this river starts moving because of the landscape, the geography. The data that was provided via that image is 6 hours delayed. So how useful would it be as a shopkeeper if I pack up thinking, well, I know where the river level was at lunchtime, just at that point it starts raining, I can start to see it rising only 6 hours later. Okay, what kind of insight can I gain into this? By the way, this information is now available via an API, so it's not static images anymore. You can actually query it. It's still 6 hours delayed. I've also just noticed that the Environment Agency have started sharing an API on that. I've not looked into the currency of that. So open data is sort of starting to address potentially some of these issues. But you can imagine building up flood warning kind of networks locally where people understand, you can put contingency plans into place and react to events as they change. What I did in response to this, I had some time on my hands at the time, not a lot because I was looking after a 9-month-old baby, was put together a website called Hebden Rising, and started to plot out the businesses which were closed and open. They're all open now. Okay, as my wife pointed out, some of them have shut down, but this is no longer a live website, so that's fine. But I started to plot out businesses that were closed, businesses that were open, businesses that had, changed how they were operating, so maybe they'd popped up somewhere else in a different property, to try and give people information. Okay, I had to generate the data set, the raw data set myself by walking around and geolocating. Very, very time consuming, okay, and actually took up a huge amount of my time in creating that. Had I had something to base that on, this would have happened a lot more quickly, arguably would have had a bigger impact. Okay, so the message of this first story is open data is important to communities. There are 2 very good examples of things that could have been done differently, could have happened perhaps more quickly to react to the floods. So spin forward 2 or 3 years. I left IBM in February this year, having worked there for actually 19 years, as it happened. And got involved with Paul at the ODI Leeds, did some work for ODI HQ, did a little bit of work on Ruby coding for them, so all sorts of exciting stuff there. So I've got kind of involved in open data as a topic, and it's sort of something I'm starting to build some experience in. And I thought, well, it'd be really good to share my experiences of trying to get my head around this. Okay, so I thought, oh damn, I knew I should have plugged my laptop in. Excuse me, sorry Paul, I'm gonna... Oh, that's still up. That's worrying. This is not good. No, not anymore. That is slightly disturbing. I shall unreplug and see if that does the job. Right. I might have to do that occasionally during the pitch, so apologies in advance. Okay. So beginner's guide to open data, and there's a bit of a pun in there, which I'll explain in a minute. But the Open Data Institute seems to have an unhealthy obsession with Taylor Swift. I don't know if you've come across this. So one of the developers down there, they've got a big cardboard cutout of Taylor Swift in the ODI canteen. One of the techies down there has created a Twitter bot which sits there and watches any mention of open data, and the Open Data Taylor Swift, the Taylor Swift Institute, decided to bless my tweet. So I'm presenting a beginner's guide to Taylor Swift. Well, this gave me an idea of framing. The other thing to learn, by the way, about this is I really need a new publicity shot, because that's just horrendous, isn't it? But anyway, so I'm trying to take you through a little journey of the Taylor Swift Institute, who've got some data. They know that they want to publish, but they haven't really thought about how to do it. So here is CEO, oh, it's not going to keep working now, is it? CEO of the Taylor Swift Institute, Taylor Swift, knows she wants to publish data, doesn't know how, doesn't know what to do. And open data is like an elephant. I'm making this fairly bold assertion at this point. You know the old story about sort of blind people standing around an elephant, and each one describes it very differently. So to one it's like a column or a tree trunk. The other one it's like a snake, it's a rope, or it's like a blanket or a sail. Well, open data is very much like that. There's a whole different raft of things to think about. You've got the technical, you've got policy, you've got how do you process it. For some people, anonymization is the main concern. How people are going to use it. Applications, we've got some great applications sort of talked about here. Who owns the data? Interesting one. What's the quality of that data? Can we rely on it? Can we trust it? What's the legal sort of status of that? And do we have a business case around that? So there's a whole heap of things that as an organisation, as an individual thinking about open data, you need to consider. And of course, the other thing that you do with elephants, famously, is you eat them. So how do you actually go about eating the open data elephant in this instance? And if we turn that into, here's our fairly simple aim. We want to make a CSV file plus some associated stuff available online somewhere so that people can use it. And we've got all of these things to get through. Well, oops, it's, sorry if I blinded somebody just over there, I pressed the wrong button. It's a bit like one of the spaghetti graphs that Tom was talking about. There's a whole series of different routes, and you might end up revisiting things and going around loops a number of times. So this leaves us with, a bit of a confusion, a whole set of things that need to be done, some kind of issues. But Taylor Swift has a plan. And Taylor Swift's plan is a method. So my background in IBM was in architectural work, so infrastructure architecture and applications architecture, that sort of thing. But in particular, I used to teach quite a lot on methods, architectural methods. I once had the privilege, or slightly nervous, worrying situation, of having Rashik Palmer as a student in one of my 3-day classes. I could say I taught him everything he knows, but that not strictly be true. So I've got a lot of experience of thinking through application of methods and building methods up and sort of teaching about. So I thought, well, that's quite applicable here. And what a method ultimately does is tell you a few things. It tells you what you need to create, what's the outcome you're trying to achieve. Okay? And then maybe sort of sub-outcomes and then sort of a large end goal. It kind of tells you when you need to do them, and I've classified that as tasks. Okay, so if you'll allow me to reuse kind of a what kind of term, it just says, here are things that you need to do in a rough ordering. Okay? And then it might say who needs to do them, so who are the stakeholders, who are the people involved. So it is, in addition to the what, who, and when, it also might say how. So it gives you some guidance, gives you some advice on best practice, captures things that worked in the past or things that haven't worked. And kind of importantly, it also says why. So it says this is the motivation for doing this particular thing. And if you reflect on that a bit, that's really useful, because if doing a particular task is not relevant to your situation, don't do it. If that doesn't sit within the context of the thing that you're trying to achieve, then you can hack this method around. And the sort of the hallmark of a really well thought through and structured method is that you can actually do that. You can choose not to do a particular thing, and that is going to become very annoying. Right, we're back. You've seen the bill, okay. But this is a lot of extra work, isn't it? Okay, well, ultimately all we're trying to do is to publish this CSV file. We know we've got a set of things to think about in advance. This feels like kind of a lot of busy work. Well, I'll give you the example of scaffolding. And we know a thing or two about scaffolding in Hebden Bridge. This is just at the end of my street. Lots of underdwellings, 2-storey underdwellings. And let's imagine the job here was I've got to replace a cracked tile. Okay, you've got to build a whole set of scaffolding in order just to get to the top of the building to do that. And yes, it's busy work, but it's very important busy work, because it means that what you're doing is safe and secure. Okay, and you're not going to end up, with a trip to A&E to have a broken back sort of sorted out when you fall off the top of the roof. There are other alternatives. I mean, you could do some sort of some climbing, abseiling kind of thing. Maybe works in certain contexts. Maybe it's good for a, But you need to put the scaffolding in place. The point about that is, that's all critical work as well. Okay, knowing what you need to get away with. So, Taylor Swift's vision of the future. And I'm getting through this fairly quickly, which is good because it's lunch next, but there'll be some time for questions. And this is based on some work that Paul and I did with the Combined Authority. So we went in and had the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. We went in, did a very brief study on what they needed to do in order to open some data. And we put together this kind of three-step or three-phase kind of approach, okay, with a process improvement layer on there. And broadly speaking, you've got a phase where you're preparing to do the work. And that's really about getting all your stakeholders aligned, understanding business cases, doing some assessment of the task in hand, if you like. Then you've got a road mapping section in the centre where you are thinking, well, what do we do first? What do we tackle first? What do we think about in the future? Are we definitely going to do release 1 and then release 2 within 6 months, or is it release 1 now, see how it goes, and then perhaps think to publish that further on? So just thinking through what we're trying to achieve in the short term, and maybe keeping that fairly small, reduced data set, because that becomes important when we're talking about execution, because kind of the implication of publishing data is that it needs to be a sustainable process. So once it's out there, you need to go through the process to release data, relatively frequently. If it's okay having one set of data published, but if that is then not refreshed, it very quickly goes stale, becomes less useful because it hasn't got the up-to-date information in there. So sustainability is important, and if that is thought about in terms of the roadmap, you might choose to start small and keep that sustainable, build the practices, and then expand that from there. Obviously, all the way along, you want to make sure that you're feeding back to your key stakeholders, and you ought to also be capturing stuff that's worked well, so that in the future you can go through and do it again. Okay, and this is based in part on some of the thinking that's in the Government Service Design Manual. I've done quite a bit of work with DWP recently and sort of other sort of public sector organisations within IBM when I was there. And there's a lot of good stuff in the Government Service Design Manual in terms of practice around how to think about this stuff. So I've kind of reflected that into a bit of an open data context. So each of these in turn, if we're in the prepare phase, we've got to think about a number of things. We've got to think about the context in which we're doing this, and really that kind of breaks down into what's our motivation for doing this? What are our stakeholders? Why are we doing this? What's the point of this in the first instance? And then we can start looking at our data sets. So do we understand where the data is held, what the data model is, assessing the quality of that data? Do we know if there are issues with the data as it's held in source? We need to do some cleansing, some scrubbing. Is there potentially some sensitive data in there that we want to make sure doesn't get released? Either that might be commercially sensitive, it might be personally sensitive information. And then if we're thinking about potentially large data sets, is there going to be an issue with, publishing several million records a week of a particular data set? Do we want to think about some summarization? So understanding what we've got is kind of the first, if you like, physical thing that we need to do after understanding context. Then we ought to think about how people might be using this. So this is when we start to think about use cases. We start to think about user stories, to use the service design parlance. So who's the audience for our data set? If we presented that with some additional data or some ability to tie that in with another data set, would that suddenly become much more useful? Can we actually infer some sensitive data from the data set we're releasing? So the example we came up with at the Combined Authority was related to travel data. And while we can scrub out anything which is immediately personally identifiable within the data, so we remove kind of account information or any kind of personally identifiable information, you might start to then look at a higher level analysis of the data and say, well, we know that there is every week on a Tuesday there is one particular journey that occurs. So you can start to identify patterns of movement which might quickly resolve down into something which kind of might start to become sensitive. So you've got to think through how this data may be used. And as I said about, would a summarized data set be appropriate? Would it limit it too much? And then thinking about constraints. And this is not necessarily to be, not catastrophized particularly, but just to be aware of things that might sort of trip us up on the route to opening the data up. So legal status of the data, is it owned by us? Do we have a right to share it? How are we bringing it in from a third party and doing some processing it ourselves, which means that we need to get their agreement to open it up? Do we have any technical challenges in terms of the environment that sits in terms of cracking that open? You're always going to get funding issues, I suspect. Do we have the funding lined up for this, or do we need to sort of make a play for that in some way? And finally, do we have the technical resources to actually do that? So that's sort of a lot of thinking work at this point, and I suspect that this is going to be, well, it could be a fairly quick bit of thinking, but ultimately this is going to be a constrained block of time up front, thinking through some of the issues and trying to assess what they are. And we've got this idea of road mapping. So if you like, all of the stuff that sits in here, in this backlog, is kind of driven out of our thinking. And this backlog again is a service design kind of term. And what we do is we'll take stuff that we want to do and push it into one of a number of releases. Release one might be the first limited, perhaps a constrained set of data, or possibly with some quality issues, and then we might wish to enhance it for a second release. Well, let's make a statement about that now, because then that says this will enable us to maintain momentum as we're moving forward. You might just say, well, look, we don't really know what we're doing with this going forward. We'll just put a release one out there, and all the other stuff will sort of sit there on a shelf, ready for when we do pick it up again. Wake up. Right, for each of those, we've got kind of a very, very high-level process, massively simplified from the real world, by the way, but bear with me for a second, it kind of works. So we've got places where data sits, where it resides within our operational or MI systems. Okay. Then we've got some process by which we extract that and transform and potentially augment it with other data. All the stuff that was being talked about in terms of the data city, that's a really great example of some very complex processing that you could go through. But it might be as simple as, extracting it, running through a few Excel macros and spitting out a CSV at the far end. So there's a whole range of different things. But you certainly need to think about that. You need to think about how you're going to process it and what you're going to do to it. Okay. The format of that data is, clearly important. CSV is sort of becoming a de facto standard, but it may well be that you provide it in a CSV format, some other formats to go along with that. And by the way, while you're publishing that data set, you also need to publish some supporting documentation, some metadata, some information about the information, some data about the data, guidance documents saying how to interpret and how to use it, and maybe even some sort of sample applications, showing how it could be used. And then ultimately, some kind of publication process, potentially into something like the data mill or the newly launched, I haven't quite got it in my mind, Datawrks, Calderdale Dataworks, thank you. Heard it here first. So, there's a publication process there. And obviously, if you've got a platform in mind, there will be some standards around how to publish within that, and it's useful to understand that. So that's in terms of our road mapping. And then we kind of need to get on and do it. Okay, so for release 1, we need to go through the build. We might need to then inspect what's been created and iterate around that a few times to sort of iron out some issues. This is not exactly rocket science. Although I found out that the hackathon on Thursday, quick plug for that, is going to have somebody who was involved in the shuttle launch there, sort of mentoring, which is going to be great. So literally rocket science in that instance. And then we need to operationalize it. We need to make that happen. I'm very proud of that particular graphics, but anyway. We need to make that happen on a repeated basis. And one of the goals at the end of the rainbow, not the only one, because naturally, the applications and the potential business benefits are there. But one of the things that we might also be aiming for is some kind of certification of our publication. So it's been mentioned, I think, a couple of times already today, but ODI have a certification process for data that's been published, asks a series of questions about the data set. Now, my hope is that, and I haven't yet done the sort of the feedback into the overarching process, but my hope is that by following some kind of structured process, you're at least collecting the information and making the right decisions in the right way to make that certification process slightly more seamless, shall we say, and painless. But it's got different levels, right the way from this is a pilot launch of data through to an exemplar of really excellent practice in open data publication. So that's the process in a nutshell. In terms of what we've done with Wickr, we presented this to them just last week. They are interested in taking it forward, so perhaps if you come and talk to myself and Paul in a month or two's time, we might have actually started moving through the process. I'm also going to be taking this hopefully down to the ODI summit in a month or so's time and running a workshop on it. So my idea is to start sort of building some material up around this and trying to capture and structure best practice, which is already out there really more than anything else, just so that next time I'm completely new to open data, I can go back and have a look at it. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Have you?
What was the data that you put through this process?
What is the data we put through the process? So the example we used in West Yorkshire to sort of think through the process was it's the English National Concessionary Travel Scheme data. So it's data which is collected on buses, okay, from your card sort of usage. So sort of travel cards, and there's a whole bunch of data held there. Basically at the moment to support payment of ENCTS scheme data out to bus operators, because they give free travel, but then they claim the money back from the authority where the travel takes place. So we've started looking through what that data is, what it could be used for, what we could do to augment it. And there's quite a lot of interesting questions have been raised by that.
Pay for people bus passes.
Yeah.
So but the bus operators have got the data at the moment. So we want to get hold of that data and make use of it.
Yeah, quite so. But more importantly, I think Wickr are very interested in whether this can be an approach that they can roll out more times in the future. So we've sort of started thinking about it in a more structured manner. Had they not had that aim, we might just have gone ahead and done it and just given them an outcome. But I wanted to finish by coming back to that mapping story about Hebden Bridge, and open corporates has been mentioned a number of times. I thought I'd give you an example of how that API can be used to generate something of interest. So there's an API there. I did a bit of techie processing, along with some other open data from the Ordnance Survey, and created some map layers effectively, and built that into this kind of visualization of businesses registered in Hebden Bridge. Kind of interesting stuff there. I'll quickly walk you through that in a second. If I click on here, will that go? No. Yeah, where's my mouse gone? Oh, this isn't going to work now, is it? Because I'm in the wrong. Bear with me, one more second. There we go. So here's my visualization of that data. So that data that I previously took, a couple of weeks of pounding around Hebden Bridge in spare moments to create, that took me a Sunday or Saturday evening to create, 2 or 3 hours just to pull that together. That shows the power of it. I've also learned some very interesting things about businesses in Hebden Bridge, which is that actually the registered addresses for a lot of businesses is their accountants. So there's Cresswell's, and there's another accountant's just over the way here, and here's the town hall. So it's interesting to see the clustering, but maybe the clustering is not that interesting. So some more processing required on this, but it just goes to show what is feasible in a pretty short period of time. So I was making very copious notes in my mind as you were doing all that, thinking I've got some busy time ahead. That was all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Super.